Ich möchte jetzt unser letztes Panel in diesem
I want to now announce our last panel for the evening, critical infrastructure, what can be built, and as a follow-up to what we heard before, when we talk about new institutional structures, there's usually the link to communities that form themselves. And that is also what this panel is addressing, because Cassie Thornton, who has consistently focused on the unknown, on the unforeseen forms of collectivity, is also interested in institutional criticism, but also in healing methods. So she's focusing on these topics. And the unforeseen, or the unforeseen possible, has actually happened. So we have two of our guests joining us online. Massimiliano unfortunately cannot be here as he's ill. And we have two guests who are joining us remotely. So enjoy the talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Angela, welcome to the last panel of the first day of 6 days in total. Welcome in the stream. This is, I am Kolja Reichert. I'm curator for discourse at the Bundeskunsthalle, co-curator together with Angela Lammert of this conference, which for a moment felt like it's falling apart yesterday when the German train system was stuck and it seemed like no one was able to actually get here. This is the reason why we have Julio and Cassie on screen. But before we get into the matter of actual infrastructural failure, just a brief reflection on the role of critique and how it has changed and what we have learned also over the day. There was a certain time when critics felt safe, I think, when criticality was nearly a currency that would grant you university teaching positions, that would make your artwork more apt to get reviews in certain critical magazines that produced value based on criticism. And today, I experience this day as a kind of further disillusionment about the efficiency of criticism. We saw how it was sidelined by platform capitalism taking over everything, including our souls and minds. Mm-hmm. And I trust that we invited 3 people tonight who might expand our imagination in what alternative and sustainable infrastructures might be possible. We have Julio Linares, born in Guatemala, living in Berlin, a cultural economist, no, an economic anthropologist, I'm sorry, Julio, who studied under David Graeber and organizes with groups around the world around climate debt and environmental issues. And he co-founded, as part of a big movement which is called Circles Universal Basic Income, Circles UBI, which I had problems finding anything in the internet about, which is exciting in the first place. Cassie Thornton is an artist, head of the Feminist economic department, who in her work and practice always has researched the historical and materialistic foundations of art and other societal infrastructures. Cassie has worked alongside hedge fund managers along the topic of debt, both historical and economical, and how the matter of debt is deeply ingrained in our daily livings and beings. And Cassie founded the Hologram, which I would characterize as a peer-to-peer network of care that crosses all hierarchies and can permeate any institution, which Cassie is currently busy helping with in German hospitals. And we have Fernando-García Dory, one of the founders of Inland. In 2009, 2010, this group of today 11 people looked into building an infrastructure from artistic and architectural thinking, but connected to actual community building and soil management in the north of Spain. Mm-hmm. Inland has recently more and more been talked about as an alternative infrastructure and an interesting art project, with a wider shift from autonomous art to applied art. No, not applied art, but like art as a field where you could think about different modes of organization, which led to, no surprise, inland being also invited in the Lombung community in this year's Documenta. I would like to start with Cassie. I hope you all got some rest. I mean, yesterday night, I have to mention this because we are here in a state infrastructure, right? A cultural institution by the state. And these guys have been caught in Uelzen yesterday after a 6 hours train ride from Berlin, which is near Lüneburg, and had to take a bus back at night, bringing them early morning back to Berlin. Thank you for still being available online. So much for state infrastructures. It seems to be a moment where there's really like growing space to think about alternative infrastructures. Cassie, you also author something that happened today here. We saw a man crying, sometimes in the audience, sometimes in the restrooms. Can you maybe tell us the secret behind this crying?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me. Sorry not to be there. Yeah, so this person is a friend, Furu, and I hired him because I asked when I was first invited to be in this conference if there would be a way to make space for feelings that are not usually allowed in a space like this or at a conference like this. And it's a project and a practice that I've been working with and on for many years. I think for over a decade. I've often paid like performers or actors to kind of like produce the feeling in spaces that I don't have the guts to produce, when those feelings I feel like are really important information. And so the feeling, I think, to be honest, when I was invited by Kolja into this conference,
Angela, if I may add.
And Angela, yes, totally. I think that I had a real struggle about if I should come, because sometimes I feel like more discourse, spending more time in more art institutions, it feels like it takes away from organizing. And sometimes it feels like it takes away from the real important work that's happening in the world. And I feel a lot of grief around what is happening in the world in the way that many art institutions are not able to respond, but most institutions aren't able to respond. So I think that Furu played a really important role today, sort of creating space for disillusionment and discontent and complexity, when otherwise I think it's much easier to do what I've been calling reality maintenance, where we just do whatever we can to sort of keep things going forward, to kind of keep reproducing what we know because it's easy. And so I'm so grateful for Furu for putting himself on the line like that. I think it's really brave and really incredible and important work to produce infrastructure of dissent, of unhappiness, of an unwillingness to comply. So that was happening today, and I'm so sorry that I wasn't there to witness it and to feel it.
I'm sorry you missed out on it, Cassie, on your own work. I was close to crying the first time I saw Furu, and certainly his experience in Buto came through. And I remembered something that you said earlier this summer when we talked. Criticism should hurt. No, you said criticism hurts. Yeah, so we had someone crying. But maybe, Cassie, just quickly, what is good criticism? Like, when does criticism hurt? What is a good feedback that could work?
I mean, I think this is going to be a really interesting question for all of us to answer. But I feel like I think what we all do in our work, all three of us, and most really powerful long-term projects come from incorporating feedback and critique throughout a project so that it doesn't come from the outside, it comes from inside. So that we can actually trust each other enough to know that when we do something wrong within a collective, within a community, that someone will be honest enough with us to tell us what hurts them so that we can change. I think that we have a lot to learn, and maybe Julio will talk a little bit about this from
Julio, I would love to. Sorry.
Other cultures where critique is an embedded part of friendship, of collaboration, of revolutionary struggle, because I think that one thing that I would love to talk about while we're here at some point tonight is that something that I see a lot in organizing spaces is people that do a lot of self-critique, and maybe there's a way that we don't really get a lot of really honest information from people around us. Sometimes we can work really for a long time on things we really care about, and we don't know who to ask for critique. We don't know who we can trust, who will be honest with us and support us and love us and also ask us to transform, to kind of meet the challenges that we're facing. And I think we don't have to critique ourselves so hard if we can trust that other people who love us will do it with us and for us. And I think Julio has a lot of cool stuff to say about this. He's taught me a lot about this himself.
I do have friends I love who I sometimes have battles with, even online. Or I feel in a conversation that something could be even taken online. Here's a little shout out. And this is a very vulnerable position we put each other in. If everything is just like shortly before landing online and be exposed in a huge audience, which relates to circles UBA kind of being opaque. So I would love to hear from Julio. I also heard that Furu, the performer who cried today, is part of Circles UBI. So I would love to learn more about this network that the Bundeskunsthalle has been working together today. Julio, could you expand a bit on what critical alternative infrastructure you are busy building?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having me, and also Cassie for saying what you said just now. I'm really sad we couldn't be there, but yeah, unfortunately there were some problems with state infrastructure failing, and so now we're here joining online. So I work on a project that's called Circles UBI, which is really trying to create some sort of infrastructure for the commons. And what I mean by the commons in this sense is to, what we're trying to do is to create a monetary system, a monetary fabric that is powered by people. So you might know, or you might have heard, that today's way in which money or debt is produced happens through central banks who issue out the deposits and reserves that then private banks use to issue more debt out, and eventually it gets to people in the form of wages. But of course, this is a very extractivist system. So when we talk about struggles that have to do with mining or extractivism in any form of way, what we're really talking about is debt or debt extraction. And so what Circles is trying to do is to make a system that instead focuses the economy on people, whereby people are the ones who are issuing the money, not as a form of debt with an interest that you have to pay back to a bank or to the state, but as an unconditional basic income. An unconditional basic income, or a bedingungsloses Grundeinkommen of Deutsch, is it's a very important struggle in the present moment so that we can actually do a transition. What a basic income is can be defined as an unconditional amount of money that is given to people, or in this case, it is issued by people, without any form of means testing or work requirements. So you do not have to prove to anyone that you are poor or that you're a specific gender or that you have so and so many children. But normally, a basic income is thought about from the perspective of the state. So what we're trying to do with Circles is to say, we don't want to wait for the state to give us a basic income. How about if we give it to ourselves? So in that sense, Circles is really a peer-to-peer network for exchange, for local trade to take place. So to support what you will call the local economy or the regional economy. And so why is this important? Well, it's not just the trains that are failing these days. You saw recently how the gas pipelines that cross from Russia to Europe were also destroyed. You have supply chain breakages all over the world, which is causing prices to go up while people's wages are still the same. And so what we're trying to do with Circles in the pilot that we're running in Berlin is to say, what happens if we could build our own value chains, our own value networks, our own supply chains, in a way where it can bring local resilience to the economy? So we work with businesses, we work with farmers, we work with co-ops that produce their own stuff, produce their own food, or give services, as they're called today. It can be therapy, it can be any form. It can be a Steuerberater, which is very important in Germany, unfortunately. Everyone needs a tax advisor. So we have some in the network as well that accept Circles. But just basically anything that allows people to free up time. Because that's what basic income is really about, is to give people the power to say no and to have the time to do what they want to do. So in this case, it would be no to a government, no to a boss, or no even to a violent partner. So we're doing this pilot now for about a bit over a year. And it's quite small, I would say. It's about 700 people, more or less, 700 to 1,000 people. We work with about a bit more over 30 businesses in the area of Berlin and also Brandenburg a little bit. And what we're really trying to do is to build some form of local economic counterpower to say, what happens when these shocks come, when the sort of crises that we're living in happen, how could we develop tools, infrastructures, that allow communities to withstand the waves and the crises as they come.
Mm-hmm. There's a certain reason why money has most of history been issued, or like at least modern history, been issued by a central bank. Central banks are an answer to the problem of trust. If you work with money, you need to trust its value. Central banks do that. The state guarantees the value, right? We have, of course, in the last years seen exciting experiments with blockchain technology, where the question of trust is managed by a shared protocol and like rule of game. So whoever has enough like calculation power to solve the riddle, to add the next block to the chain, gets some reward. And that is how trust is organized there. I didn't yet fully understand how you organize trust and how, I mean, I understand it in like a regional community where you have face-to-face encounters. But if we would make a jump and imagine it globally, how would people trust each other worldwide that the money they issue to each other has value?
Yes, this is a very, very good question. In Circles, we work a lot with the principle of trust. So we even have a critique around the blockchain world that is based on trustlessness, or at least it was for the first decade. And now people are coming around because of projects like Circles to understand the importance of trust, of human trust, that is not mediated by machines, or in another way. So how can you build infrastructures that promote trust, and where the digital infrastructure is just a way of expanding that. So one analogy that we always give to people is this idea of the 6 degrees of separation that connect anyone on the planet. And so in the Circles network, when you want to enter Circles, you need to have 3 people in the current implementation, at least 3 people who already are in the network to trust you. And what the trust means is to say, to validate that this person is a person, so instead of having someone scan your passport or your retina or some crazy type of data mining of sorts, what happens is people say, hey, yeah, this person is nice, I trust them, I'm willing to accept their circles, I trust them, and so they enter, and when they enter, they can basically pay anyone within the network indirectly. So if, for example, if the Pope were to be in circles, and I know that I trust Cassie, and Cassie trusts you, Kolja, and Kolja, you know someone who knows the Pope, I could trigger a payment to pay the Pope through all these different trust relations. So there is sort of a rippling, or we call it transitive exchange or transitive trust. And so this is these mechanisms allows us to have a network that is hyper local and potentially global. So at the moment we have about 200,000 accounts or validated accounts all over the planet. So we have people trying to use circles in places like Chile, places like Costa Rica, in the Netherlands. Sometimes we get orders in the marketplace we have from the Philippines with people trying to buy stuff for circles there. But at the moment, we're really just focused on Berlin because we know we're in a type of research and development phase to make this infrastructure more resilient.
And what is the material infrastructure of it? Like, how does the information flow? Where's my wallet?
Okay, so on the technical level, Circles runs on a blockchain that is called XDAI, or well, now it's called Gnosis Chain, which runs on a, you mentioned before, the blockchain type you were mentioning was more a proof of work algorithm. The blockchain that we use at the moment runs on a proof of authority and proof of stake algorithm. And what that means is that there is a sort of a set of validators within a pool that say, we accept the transactions that are happening within the network. So Circles is an application that runs on this blockchain. And then the wallets are all on your are all on people's browsers. So essentially, when you make a Circles wallet, you basically are just going to a website. It's circles.garden. Again, circles.garden. And when you enter, all the data and all the information, when you make a wallet, lives there. So if you lose your private key or your seed phrase or your mnemonic phrase, we like to call them magic words. If you lose your magic words, then you cannot longer enter, and no one really can help you to get them back. And so we really believe in this idea that people should be able to hold their own money, so they should also be able to own it and not be in the possession of, let's say, a balance sheet of a bank in a server somewhere, right? And it's a very good question, because we are trying to move towards creating local first federated applications, which means that the applications run first on the devices of the network on a peer-to-peer basis and can be federated based on need, similar to the paradigm of the Fediverse. I know you see a lot of people now doing this exodus to Mastodon and so on. So we really believe in this type of, I guess, in Berlin, there is a very strong undercurrent of peer-to-peer software.
Thank you so much. The system of trust based on three people very much reminds me also of the structure of the hologram that Cassie developed together with others. But before we get back to Cassie, I would like to bring Fernando in and ask you, you are an artist, and at some point you decided to build an infrastructure. What led to this decision, and what did you build?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the opportunity for learning and being so inspired with the talks here. Yesterday I heard about circles, and I'm super interested as well in the hologram. So this is a super good opportunity for going deep onto that, and also with the previous roundtable, because when Chem was saying at the end what we are interested is in finding ways to have a regular income without compromising our criticality. This is what actually was a little bit of a point of departure. That and understanding the post-40s condition of the cultural worker, the very vulnerable link in a whole chain of value that places the cultural worker or producer inside that murmuring multitude, that Pascal Guillen was talking about. And at the end, how we can secure the material conditions of our existence. So for me, also growing up in between the city and a remote rural area, it was important also to look at the eco-social crisis, no, in which this model is building somehow, is going towards. And in that sense, I think it was needed for me to just move from that form of criticality you mentioned before, that is actually coming back from the time of the manifestos of the avant-garde, no? Like pointing at something that is wrong and we could change, and maybe even a poetical sense, but actually going more into a poetical, no? Or into a productive, constructive form of transforming things in the here and now, and not only the imaginaries. So the whole proposal of Finland is to think on a project about an organization, a parent institution that could look at those aspects that are modeling our forms of life, forms of living. For example, the knowledge and training. So we started with the possibility of creating a space to put together the cultural worker and the land worker. How we could think on new narratives to reposition the heritage of peasant and indigenous cultures as a needed reset of our paradigm of civilization. So instead of the vision of eternal growth and being in a big metropolis as paradigm of cosmopolitanism and being a hyper-mobile, hyper-productive global player in a VIP area of a terminal, could we look at the shepherd as paradigm also of another form of observation, economy of attention, understanding times, understanding the relation with the non-human. And yeah, so it involves, as I mentioned, these projects that rethink how we acquire knowledge with the Inland Academy, that is a form of postgraduate that connects theoretical learning with practical learning, and the Shepherd School that started in 2004. And then as well the production that combines artistic production, and we also make cheese. So it's a way of maybe securing, as Chem was mentioning,
and also
those
blockchain-based.
Actually, it was very interesting to hear
the cheese coin that you developed with Hito Steyer.
We often artists, we go into things and we kind of flirt with ideas and represent them, but not go really, seriously into making replicable and self-sustainable models. And I think that what Julio was saying is very interesting, because this idea of the cheese coin that we were thinking was very much based on the idea of an anti-NFT, or not necessarily passing through complex technologies, but more based on the validation of the community of users. So it's still in a very embryonic phase. But we are also working with Miyu and Vian Chan, two art economists, and on a social impact bond, or social environmental impact bond, form of a financial product that could also sustain these social engaged practices. But
what is the infrastructure at the moment, and where do you see it going? How many places do you work at? How many communities are involved?
That's that's also interesting, because we think in a model more based on the patterns of growth, for example, of beehives. Beehives don't grow enormously or endlessly, but they reproduce in this federated way different units that can coordinate. So we have an abandoned village in the north of Spain that we are rebuilding, and it's where we have the shepherd school, the cheese production, an apiary, and then there is this sheep of flock that actually goes then to the city. And because for us it's important to think that these models are not for an opt-out option, just to create our bubble. Maybe all the back to the land movements in the 70s and 60s very often, or 80s, were about thinking that we could have an alternative thing separated from. But actually for us, more than the land as a space of retreat or landscape, is more like a land occupy, or a space of inhabiting the friction, rethinking the space of custodianship as well of territory. So these sheep come to Madrid, and then we graze the big park in Madrid, and then we develop different artistic projects, from a sonic anthropology of the rural decay, or collaborations of every kind, the one with Hito Steyer you mentioned, and others. But I think it's important to project what we are doing, both in the art world. For example, we think it's important to take part in the cultural conversation and also show to many other practitioners and people who are entering the field that there could be other ways to develop a practice. And also, for example, in the social movements, we are developing a global pastoralist alliance. So part of the international bureaucracy of the UN, we got the UN to declare the International Year of Pastoralists, and maybe there is an ironic gaze on this.
Sorry, what was the year?
An International Year of Pastoralists and Gracelands. So within the UN system, for example, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, or now the COP of Climate Change, we try to bring the voice of the pastoralist communities around the world, either Central Asia or the Maasai peoples or in different places.
The milk makers and processors, right?
Yes, to try at least to make the point that, that there is like other realities in the everyday beyond this spectacle of the apparent transformation that the supranational bureaucracies often show, that is more and more co-opted by the big actors in the economy. But yeah, just to end, maybe to connect with the whole also ground for this conference, the question of our critique. I think that what we need to understand or to start to learn is new skills for the artist. It's no longer just to be a good painter representing a landscape as it was, or just a free agent questioning the formats and everything, but actually maybe needs to know as well on, for example, works as the hologram on participatory action research method, on sociological techniques. So what we do, it doesn't matter if it's formally good or not, is how it happens, where it happens, and with whom and for whom. So it's new contexts for art creation.
When do you decide when it's good?
That's actually something that I think that was a little bit under question in this documenta, no? That we cannot apply the criteria or the let's say often tautological self-referential forms of validation of contemporary art traditional critique, but we can't also give for valid something that has a good cause, for example, saying like is politically engaged. No, we need to start to look at aspects as the form of sustainable and durational engagement, the forms of understanding impact that are not only quantitative but also qualitative, how meaningful, how useful this is. And we are now translating the book Lexicon of Usership by Stephen Wright. And I think that's interesting because an art proposal maybe would be good when it keeps sustaining itself because it was useful for the context of users around, like circles or like hologram. Art Placing Group was an interesting APG group in the 70s that artists were going to, I don't know, British Airways. In this case, it was corporate context. But for us, it's like about the village artists. It's about the village artists of the future. Like, what would make sense in a context that is not the institutional art world? And also not only the platforms, because before we heard something like there is the platforms and there is the institution. Well, there are also a whole permaculture of an ecosystem of culture creation that is happening, for example, in the rural.
But it's maybe important to make a distinction between two types of useful art, I guess. Like there might be useful art that is useful under criteria that are already there, and there might be useful art that at the core works on creating new ideas of what's useful and new users, right? There I would see a classical analogy to the classic concept of the artwork, that instead of new forms of you craft something, you look for new forms of organizing together and down to the bacterial level, one could say, right? Cassie, was there a point where you shifted your practice and you understood that you want to speak more to people outside the art world? Or was it always that way, that your curiosity drove you to strangers?
I mean, I think I always was making work for my mother. And she's a really tough audience. I mean, I've always been interested in culture that makes it to people that just have jobs and who, I mean, most of my work that I think has been interesting at all has just been exploring the conditions of the world that I was born into, which was one where, you know, my family just experienced like really extreme poverty and kind of rode the waves of, you know, American neoliberal financial capitalism and patriarchy and racism. And so like my work has always been just trying to understand if when we like lost our house, was that our fault or was that something else? And so it took a really long time to identify the systems. I mean, those systems were meant to be opaque. And so it took me, you know, a decade to be able to really explain how we're not broken, it's the systems that are. And so I think, you know, my work has just always, I think it's inched closer and closer to being able to be something that my mother and the other, you know, people that she worked with at a grocery store in the middle of Indiana would be able to actually like get a laugh out of. And then maybe at some point, you know, the hologram would be something that would actually like make their life way better and maybe make their life more possible in an emergency.
Tell us about how it works.
Okay, so it's the point of the project is really to create stability and health for people, not as an endpoint in itself, but also because it is made with the wish that people would be able to have the energy and capacity to struggle to demolish systems of harm. So I think that's a really important part of this project. So how it works is really, it's sort of deceptively simple, but one person asks 3 people to support them in a really long-term way. So it's kind of like we have a hologram right now and Kolja is the hologram. And the 3 of us are like the triangle members, and we're, if the situation was reversed, which I think I recommend that we do this later, the 3 of us would be asking Kolja questions. And so one of us would ask Kolja questions about his physical health, and one person would ask questions about his mental and emotional health, and one person would ask him questions about his social health. I think the really important part of this is that Kolja invited the 3 of us to ask him questions. And so what we would do is we would have a regular meeting that was like this, where the 3 of us would ask questions. We would meet maybe like every season. And then Kolja would reciprocate by making sure that the 3 of us all have the kind of support that we want. Because one really important sort of foundational idea of this project is that all people who give care should receive care. And so as a way to sort of create a culture of care and not a closed loop, Kolja would make sure that we're all doing all right. And, you know, maybe we don't want a hologram, but maybe we do. And so maybe he would ask Julio, like, do you want to set up a hologram and how can I help you? And so in that way, the project kind of self-reproduces. And I think it's really interesting because many people really fear being a burden by asking for help or showing that they need support. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think we can argue, has a lot to do with capitalism and patriarchy. And this project, I think, really directly.
What exactly does it have to do with it? Like that you wouldn't bother the power figure in like really engaging with your weaknesses.
Exactly. Like I think it's very, very dangerous to show vulnerability. You don't want to say you're sick, because what if that means that you're not allowed to go to work and reproduce yourself financially? Or what if you're considered weak, like a weak link? I think there's so many different ways where we have been taught that we need to be defensive, competitive, the best. And it's very linked to individualism. The importance of the sort of individual to sort of be perfect. And so to reveal one's vulnerabilities is pretty radical. And then to articulate your needs is really hard, especially when it's just so undervalued. So I think that the jump there is that Kolja does not want to be a burden on us. He's worried that we already are burdened ourselves. So how could he possibly ask us for help? So then because of that, the sort of mechanism self-reproduces, because Kolja is going to make sure that we all have care in order to receive care from us. And I think that's a really important kind of mechanic of the project.
Mm-hmm. And how did you, sorry, can you quickly speak, like, where did you imply it first? Where did you test it? How did it turn out? And what is the scale of this infrastructure, if we call it that?
Mm-hmm. No. So, I mean, the project's been around as kind of a thought experiment since 2016. It's a kind of rub off of organizing that happened in Greece at the height of a financial crisis and a huge amount of migrants coming in. It was borrowed from a clinic that was experimenting with not only how to give free care to all people, but also how to give non-hierarchical care. There's a book about it. You can read about it. It's very easy to find information about that story online. But I think the interesting thing that is useful today is that during the pandemic, we started to try to really make it a much more accessible social practice. And so a group of us began to teach workshops and courses online. And we're now up to our 7th course. And we have lots of different facilitators. But we teach courses, and the courses are themed, and they're around things like, why is it so hard to ask for help? Or they're for people who are professional caregivers, things like that. And the project has, because we were teaching these courses online, we realized that we needed some other mechanisms for critique actually embedded in the process of growing the hologram. So what happened, which I think is really useful to talk about, which I think really relates to circles in a way too, is that when we taught our first course in April of 2020, and 30 people took the course, we realized that a lot of these people sort of like wanted to continue, they wanted to know each other, but also they were our first 30 people to try the hologram and to sort of build their own holograms. And so we realized really quickly that the practice, it seems like it's kind of complete in that, like, Kolja has his 3 people, we support him, he supports us to make sure that we have holograms. But I think a really important part that we realized is that that's only half. So after the first course, we began to have these monthly meetings called the Community of Practice. And that's where people come together who are all trying out the hologram, and they talk about how it is for them. And so in this monthly meeting, which we've had for like 3 years now, people basically get to talk about the tensions in the practice, what's working, what's not working, and where domination is still peeking through in the practice. So when people are still giving advice in a project that's not about advice or hierarchy, we're able to see that. So we have basically what is like a very low facilitation talking circle that happens every month for anyone to come to. And so over time, we've been able to sort of see what's happening in people's experiences and how we need to change the hologram and how the hologram is changing people. Mm-hmm. And I think this is what's really important for me, is that, like, there's always got to be a way to get information back from within. And to work from the inside out in this way means that then when we hear that something's in need of transformation, we can actually change. Mm-hmm. And the project changes with the people that use it. And so the hologram now is, I don't know how many people practice it. I'm going to say it's probably like a couple thousand people. Mm-hmm. We offer lots and lots of free workshops and like facilitated sessions and stuff online. We have a ton of facilitators from around the world. But I think what's interesting is those people that keep coming back to Community of Practice, the people who actually use the hologram, are the people that are now organizing the hologram. And so I think the amazing thing is that it is going from being an individual's art project to just like actually a project that exists in the world that is owned and not owned, but it's organized and held by the people that use it.
Kind of an autonomous infrastructure, you could maybe say. But how does this infrastructure relate to existing infrastructures? Like, can the hologram be a tool to make a corporation more efficient? Because, finally the cleaning person and the accountant and the manager are taking care of each other across hierarchies? Because I ask, because we are on some epistemic shift on many levels, and the relation to work seems to fundamentally have changed through the pandemic and being forced to stay at home. Yeah. Restaurants can't open because nobody wants to come to work. Theaters
the trains don't travel
because also one reason is actually that people don't come to work. And it really seems that you could generally broadly say there's a loss of perspective, or like a sense of sense, kind of, right? How does the hologram influence the relation that people have to the infrastructures they work in?
I think there's something dangerous about the hologram, which is really cool, and also I think deserves like a good warning, which is that I think it makes it really hard to remain dishonest. And when people...
That's threatening, yeah.
Yeah, well, when people realize the sort of power structures that they're stuck inside of, and while they have the illusion of choice, they're being exploited, or they're just incredibly unhappy, or they're not living in a way that they believe in. Like, I think the hologram makes it really hard to avoid those types of truths. And I think when we develop more radical wishes, maybe wishes that are like too dangerous to kind of be able to say out loud, I think it means that we have to change, and we have to change more than ourselves. We have to change the things around us. And most of us that grew up in, the capitalist West, we don't really know how to do things together like that. So I think it's really hard and really scary, actually, to insert it into certain situations. But I think that's why it works, and that's what it will do if it's truly used. If we've developed like a protocol, the meetings happen over 90 minutes or 1 hour. It's very structured, but I believe if people really commit to it in any corporate atmosphere, it will destroy the hierarchies. It will destroy the delusions. And I think that is quite dangerous to what I had said before, to reality maintenance. It makes it harder to kind of continue on maintaining structures of oppression, even the ones that we're not actually able to see normally.
So if someone listening in now and is scared of the hologram and wants to stop it, what would they have to do?
If they want to stop it, I don't know. I think it's inside of us. I think that the beauty of having a project that's based on a practice is that there's a lot of people that rely on it. It's like a part of our everyday lives, and it's a part of our relationships. Every time we've gotten a donation of money, I mean, I feel like that sometimes feels like the most dangerous thing. I mean, it's allowed us to organize at a larger level, but it also feels like it's very scary to handle money, which feels at times like our kryptonite, like the kryptonite for collectives where people are like, we've been brainwashed to believe in money more than anything else.
Okay, so to kill the hologram would be to finance it.
Well, we do have money, so we are kind of financed, but sometimes it does feel like I feel like that is the thing that is the hardest. I don't think any, like, as a smart person named Julio once said, nobody can kill a practice. But I think that I think that the thing that has slowed us down the most is getting money and figuring out how to use resources, because we hate money.
Thank you. Julio, do you hate money? We have three infrastructures in the room. One is focusing on the relation to the soil. One is focusing on mental health and sovereignty over your conditions of life and work. And one is for money, for validating and paying each other. Julio, could you quickly elaborate on what space the social has in circles? Because it seems like circles is basically another payment infrastructure does it create a different space for social exchange? Does it relate to the mental components of, for example, the hologram?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's land, the body, and money. No, I have there's a economic anthropologist that used to call them the three fictitious commodities: land, the body, or labor, or whatever, and money. And I think it's a very good analogy because, yeah, in fact, yeah, like the earth is not a commodity, our bodies are not a commodity, and money is also has been commodified. But it's often even hard to imagine how money cannot be commodified because of how colonized we've been, as Cassie was saying. But if you think about it, money is really a promise for the future, for a specific type of future. No, if I say, hey, I will get to a certain place in the west of Germany by a certain day and speak at a certain panel, and there is a promise there. When one way or the other, you can negotiate the agreements and so on, but promises is really what make up the world in a way. And I think what changes in circles is that suddenly people have a bit the power to make promises and then take that responsibility. And I think that's a very big shift, because it really feels differently when suddenly you go to a shop that accepts circles, and maybe before you couldn't afford as much, or you don't have enough money, and now with circles, people say, "Hey, I can finish the month now." It's maybe not a lot of money. It's maybe about, I would say, the equivalent of like 100 euros a month, because of how like small the network is. But it's still like if you don't have that much money, it already helps you to get some food, some vegetables, maybe a therapy or whatever. So I think it's more about the social relationships that happen within the universe, of circles in a way. So it allows for different connections to happen. So not just between the community of people that meet. So we have assemblies every month where people can come, and we also have markets. So we have this sort of market assembly format where people can come and use their circles, spend them, tell us what problems they have with the system. So it's quite like an iterative process to understand how the social relationships are being built, and also how that is enabled or not by the technological infrastructure. And then we feed back into our processes. And yeah, there's also the element within the businesses or the merchants network. So it's different when you are one, let's say, a producer of upcycled food. So we have, for example, one project that gets a lot of food from the supply chains that already exist that normally would go to waste. The current system wastes a lot of things, especially food. And so what they do, their whole business model is just taking food and transforming it into products that you can sell at a market. And so if we can connect them to food producers or people who do delivery, we have also a self-organized collective that does delivery. You can start to build all the different parts of what we call an economy, and then this essential stuff, these essential labors or whatever you want to call them, really, really become very important. And if people can access them, it provides some sort of a feeling of unconditionality or safety, if you want. And that feeling is really rare in today's world. Like, many people don't get to feel unconditionality in life. And so if you have a money that, or the sign of a system that nurtures unconditionality in the economy, then you sort of start to have different relationships and different ways of thinking beyond scarcity.
I like how this talk connects to the keynote by New Models earlier this day, who showed that the public sphere has been hollowed out. They said, and the public sphere is a hologram. And now we come back to the hologram, and we talk about 3 practices that seem to exist without any relation to the public sphere. Fernando, could you imagine inland the hologram and circles make connections that would complement each other?
For sure. I mean, one would say that's like a natural continuation or evolution from the models we are trying, and finding that maybe, for example, circles is working in an urban context and has a certain impact in a city of 3-4 million people. How would be the impact in in small cities of 2,000 people, or in relation to the control of the primary sector and natural resources, and for us as well, no? Like how we could incorporate aspects related with the the emotional and affective health and for example, emotional communication of the everyday in a rural context. I remember we were working in a project in the north of Turkey, and that was some of the workshops that the villages were asking with, and then to incorporate those other levels of awareness and consciousness. So yes, I think that this would be, it's going to be a natural and logical continuity of what is being tried. I also would like to think, how will these practices connect with the other criticality we just saw in the round table before? Because often it seems like water and oil, no? Like never really mixing. And I think that they do, and there are many things to learn mutually. I remember once we did a project, it was to work with seed savers that were working at home with seeds from vegetal varieties that were under the risk of being patented, with the property laws on seeds and on vegetables, and they were like keeping notebooks with who has this tomato where, and then you would call someone and you would see if that would apply to your land and maybe get them sent in an envelope. Well, through working with hackers that were fighting for property laws on software, and we're working for free software, we managed to develop a database and forms of exchange. So I think that the criticality of the meme culture, it's interesting because it's, how to say, it's based on not necessarily creating new imaginaries. So it's based on an image bank that you constantly reuse and reposition, and in that sense, it's a very useful form of camouflage, of mirroring what the society of the eternal reproduction and spectacle makes. And I think this is something we need to learn in the land-based projects that otherwise very easily can be just extracted into a new imaginary of the desire for the authentic, for the rural, and so on. So for us, for example, in inland, we try to avoid any image that represents what we are doing. No, we tend to say what happens in the village stays in the village, because otherwise you end up with a reality show. That was something we were working with. But I think it's important. And then also, as an example, one of the inland members, who is now with the goats and the sheep, became also a very successful YouTuber. And that's also interesting, because otherwise you'd be a young person that decided against all the odds to find an economy and a form of life in managing mountain pastures in a hut, and you would be probably very often thinking, I'm just part of this group of losers that the contemporary urbanocentric culture is telling us, the people of the rural are. But on the other hand, now through this YouTube channel and making his identity and expressing his critique to the institution of the national park and the way in which eco-technocracies are managing the land, he's finding also a place, a community of peers, a community of support.
Interesting.
So that's also
that's already an answer to the closing questions. A question I wanted actually to put. To make a little link, we are now at the end of our time, but I will take 2 minutes more. There will be a panel in Berlin on the 26th with Dr. Lina Eilers, Christine Wahl, both are theater critics, Hanno Rauterberg, the art editor of the weekly paper Die Zeit, and Thorsten Michaelsen of the theater group Ligna, who do immersive performances. They will talk about the participatory artwork and a certain tendency that criticism is less and less something that looks at a practice from the outside, but is something that is already applied for when you hand in the funding form. So a project would fund its own coverage and its own criticism, which can lead to the fantasy of many different worlds just commenting on themselves, which would be the opposite of the public sphere, which end new models have declared today. So I would like to, you also already answered that question with the member who became a YouTuber. But Cassie and Julio, what do you think you need the public sphere for, or don't you need it at all? Because the public sphere is also connected to criticism historically, right? Without public fear, public
sphere would be for the space of citizenship, the agora, let's say, of what's for you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Maybe Cassie first. Do you need publicity?
I think I'm really interested in public education. I think like, I mean, I just kind of drew a blank. I was like, I don't even know what the public sphere is anymore. But I do think that, I mean, I'm just most interested in like getting people together and having them see each other and see themselves as part of each other. And I think that can happen in an agora or in a situation where we're like, we are put together with some of these ideas of like what an old public sphere is. But I just feel like it's just got to be way more layered and way more non-hierarchical. Like we need to be in it with each other together.
Thank you. Julio, if I can ask for a short answer.
Yeah, I think we need to abolish the division between the private and the public completely, because it kind of takes away our ability to imagine other ways of relating to each other. So one of the things I always say is that with the basic income, people could have the ability to break this dichotomy between what is private and what is public, what is the private household and the public household. Like, I think in a way what happens is that the public is just equated to the state. And I think we need to think beyond these simple dichotomies and really practice something else.
Thank you. That's an amazing closing word for this day. It's also a link to the first talk tomorrow at 11 by Nikita Davan, an outstanding theoretician of the public sphere, who tends to explain why Kant has to be, like the whole Enlightenment has to be saved from the Europeans. Nikita Davan will talk about aesthetic enlightenment and the art of decolonization tomorrow at 11. But now, Arnold Dreiblatt, from the second generation of American minimalist musicians, like in the spirit of Lamonte Young and others, is performing now. Sorry again for Julio and Cassie that you're missing it. Everyone in the room, please move over to the restaurant. It's turning a club tonight. And at 10, we celebrate Judgment Night with Eric de Klerk, Lil Internet, and Nastya Muravyova, who just landed from Prague. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you all for the trust. Thank you for the performance, Cassie. And thank you, everyone, for joining today, and see you next door.